Okay.
So this is the church of William Bradford. We know he was baptised here. And William Bradford's importance is not in the story of the separatists, but Leyden and beyond, because of course William Bradford would become governor of the Plymouth colony and a leading member of the congregation in Leyden. But he was born here in this village, and it's very tiny, but his father died when he was a year old and his mother remarried, so that meant that quite often, you know, if you lost your husband and you remarried, the new husband's family did not want your children going with you from the dead husband. And so instead, William Bradford was brought up by his uncles and his grandfather. But then his grandfather died within a few years, and so did his mother. So he was left in the care of his uncles. But they say he was quite a sickly child, but he had a copy of a Geneva Bible.
I see.
And he became very, very spiritual. And we think it was probably at Bawtry. He may have heard Richard Clifton preach there, because Richard Clifton did come away from his own church now and then to spread the word. And he became a member of the Scooby congregation. You can imagine this fatherless child then being taken under the wing of William Brewster, just as William Brewster had become Davison's protege. You can see him becoming the father figure to this young lad. And one of the things that is telling is even William Bradford's handwriting, because William Brewster's writing is very, very distinctive, especially the way he forms a W. He has a big loop at the top of his W. So does his brother James in his signature. It's very rare. I haven't seen it anywhere else, but William Bradford signs his W's in exactly the same ways. He's emulating this father figure. Well, we know about the escape attempt to Holland. We know that you wanted to know where Plymouth fits into the story, don't you? Right. Well, I'll just clear that up for you. We're at 1620. Our group of separatists, they've been in Holland for 12 years, and now it's come to the point where they feel they must move on. Going to the New World wasn't their first choice. In fact, they'd even considered joining a Dutch group of colonists, but that didn't work. They had applied to the Virginia Company before to go to the New World. That hadn't come to fruition. But a later attempt did, and they got a patent to settle in Virginia. Patent is a permission. So you have our folk getting ready to go to Virginia. And what they decide to do is they will take their own ship with them from Holland. Because if they've got their own ship, they've got some freedom. They can come back to England on missions to, if they need to, or to even fish in the New World. They could earn a living with their own ship. So they bought a ship in Delfhaven called the Speedwell. And the idea was they'd sail over to England, they'd meet up at Southampton with the Virginia Company ship, which was an old hulk called the Mayflower. So our folk took their own ship, they came to England, they came from Holland. They didn't settle in England, they were only on the ship. The only person that was England at that time for sure that we know is Brewster, because as I told you before, he had left Holland because he'd been hunted and had hidden in London. But they come after a very tearful farewell. If you get to read of Plymouth Plantation, you'll know that John Robinson sees them off at the quayside, and there's lots of tears, lots of prayer, and they part. They come to Southampton. The Mayflower and the Speedwell take off to go to the Atlantic and across to America, to Virginia. And the Speedwell starts to take on water. Now this is surprising. They don't quite understand why. It's come from Holland, it's fine. They've engaged an English crew to take it over to the New World. They've made a contract. But the Speedwell's leaking. So what can they do? they put into the next port, which happens to be Dartmouth. They go to Dartmouth, they have the speedwell repaired, recorked. That's where they put all this string, sort of wax string, and they shove it into all the gaps and, to try to make this ship seaworthy again. When they think it is, they take off again. They get a bit further out, the water's rougher because you're coming out of the English Channel and more towards the Atlantic, and the speedwell really starts to take on water, so much so that they think it's going to sink. So they have no choice. They limp back to shore and they end up in Plymouth. That is the last port before the Atlantic. These are sailboats. You can't turn round and sort of go backwards. You have to go with the winds. They're in Plymouth and they have this terrible decision to make. What do we do with this ship? Do we leave it behind? What do we do? Do we abandon the whole enterprise? So they decided to leave the speedwell behind. Now imagine, there were a lot of people on that speedwell. It had nearly sunk twice, and some of them thought, I really don't want to do this. No, I'm not going. And some stayed behind. There were also limited places on the remaining ship, the Mayflower. So again, some of the congregation stayed behind. But in all, 105 souls go across the Atlantic in the Mayflower. They're heading for Virginia, but all these delays cost them time. And they hit storm after storm. In the end, they don't get to Virginia. They end up north of the Hudson and into New England. They actually do have a choice. Do they try to make for the Hudson? But they could have tried to turn south and make for the Hudson, but it was notoriously bad seas there. And they were already in trouble because halfway across on the voyage, the main beam in the Mayflower had snapped and they had to make a running repair to try to put that together. In fact, they nearly lost the ship, so they didn't want to endanger it by taking it into really bad waters when they could just head for New England. And that's what they did. So they ended up some 600 miles away from where they were meant to be going, which is all right because they haven't got beady eyes over them, but if you're 600 miles from the nearest civilization, you are really out on a limb. And that's where our folk end up, in New England. And of course, you know the story. They're hunting around for somewhere to make a colony. They take trips ashore on their shallop, which is a boat they would have had folded up inside the Mayflower, and then they reassembled it so that they could explore the shallower waters. And they come across a suitable place to make a settlement. The land's already been cleared because it had already been occupied by Native Americans, but they'd all died. Probably from contact with English fishermen, probably brought them smallpox, because although we didn't have a colony in New England, we knew how to fish there. We actually fished off that coast, even in the Tudor times. And so that's where our Plymouth colony is settled. And we have William Bradford becoming the second governor. First governor, John Carver, also believed to be around here. He could possibly be a Walloon. So there's a little bit of, argument about his identity, but he may equally have been a Doncaster man. He's governor, but he dies. He dies in April the following year. Bradford steps up, becomes governor, and of course is the most successful leader that they have. He's brilliant as governor, but then what do you expect being trained by Brewster? The only sad thing is, of course, is while the ship, the Mayflowers, you can imagine it, it's winter. They're just off the coast of Cape Cod. They're desperately trying to find somewhere to settle before the winter really sets in. The decks are icy, it'd be like glass underfoot, a wooden deck with water and, it's frozen. And when the little ship, the little shallop is out with the men while they're exploring, trying to find a settlement, William Bradford's young wife Dorothy falls off the Mayflower. Nobody hears her fall, probably slipped on the ice on the decks, probably going to the beak. That's the outside loo. They'd have a loo on the side of the ship. Nobody heard her, and she was found floating in the water. How awful. Can you imagine William Bradford coming back so pleased that they've found somewhere at last to settle, only to be told as he gets to the Mayflower, "We're very sorry, but your wife's been killed in an accident." Awful, isn't it? But, yeah, very sad. But a lot of other people would lose loved ones that first winter. They would lose half of their number in that first winter alone. Dreadful. How they actually survived and how they continue to survive and grow is a miracle in its own right. They shouldn't have done. If you look at it, if you look at the facts and look at what they were up against, none of them should have survived at all. It is incredible that they did. Not only that, but then they thrived. So that's how William Bradford fits into our story. Now, nobody died on the way across on the Mayflower, apart from one seaman. So none of the pilgrims died, but a sailor died, and apparently he was a horrible man. He used to pick fights with the pilgrims, tease them, taunt them, and he actually got sick and died. The only other person who died was in sight of land, and he was a young servant boy called William Button. He died within sight of land, probably from appendicitis. And that's where his story would have ended, apart from the fact that he too came from Austerfield, and the local people have put up a memorial to him. So shall we go and see that before we go off to Gainsborough Old Hall? A memorial to a poor, lowly, 15-year-old serving boy. I think that's nice, don't you?
Yeah.
At least he's remembered.